Thank you everyone for joining. Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Inclusive Excellence Education and Development Hub, or as we're most known as the Hub. Um, we are pleased to have you joining us virtually today as we celebrate Native American Heritage Month. Tonight, we will be introducing our keynote speaker, Mr. Larry Spotted Croman. We are very excited to have you here today. Mr. Croman is an award-winning writer, cultural educator, traditional storyteller, as well as a tribal musician. We invite you to have your camera on, although it's completely optional. This event will be live streamed via YouTube, so that there is a possibility that you can be shown if your camera is on. And we ask that you have your mics muted while he is speaking. Thank you all for joining us tonight. And with that, Larry, I will pass the floor to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all so much for having me this evening. Really excited to be with you all. It's, being Native American Heritage Month, it's been a busy month for us, and speaking engagements, a lot of hybrid stuff as well. As I said, thank you all for having me this evening. I would like to start off by, I'm going to talk a little bit about who I am, how I got here, my community. I have some slides to share. We'll talk about sovereignty and how the stories bring us all together. And it's important to keep in mind that some of the things I'm going to share are going to be difficult to, we have some tough stuff to go through, hard conversations that are overdue to be discussed. A lot of times, folks in general, throughout the country, for example, when this month rolls around, it's a great interest in seeing Native folks dance and take note of their art and maybe purchase some to support them and so on. But there's the underlying issues that put us in this position where we all are today need to be discussed and kind of unpacked, right? And so I hope to get to that. So the first thing I would like to say is, once again, greetings, and I'm coming to you from my traditional homelands in Massachusetts, a small area called Webster, or as we say here, Webster. I'm going to get to a little bit more of that later. So the most appropriate thing I can do is talk about this land and represent that. And the way I can best do that to open up this conversation is to speak in those traditional words that we use here. The language, the Algonquin language that has been shared here for thousands and thousands of years. The same language that reflects the ecology of the space, the water, the trees, the mountains, the land, and all the things that are around it reflect back those same words. And so we say in the greetings in my traditional language, Wun nashiano tumomanatu, tabatni, wutu chikinisen, okumis, tabatni wuchi saposu, wasukati huana, notas ninua menantiok, king nota yeo pantaminok, and the male ninua me quantam kichia, ka mata wananta, ka naguti kokutam ninua, manatu, wasukati huana, womanetio. Ka nosoko muso amoke, ninaho kinkanto chokesuchi. Yayo. I greet you in the words of peace and reciprocity. I greet you in the words of understanding and that we would share our breath together. It sounds funny in English, but in my language, when we say breath, we're actually saying as you breathe, it represents your spirit. And so we know if you hold your breath for a second, what happens, right? So our breath represents our spirit force. This is why our words are so important, what we say. And I also ask that our relatives would share in this space because we're in a diverse place these days, so that we're asking all these different folks who are the seen and unseen to share this space with us, and that we would have that opportunity to exchange ideas and words and feelings and let them out freely without judgment. And I think that's the most crucial part of that. And so we share these words in that language to kind of help us understand that the place we're in. And for example, Illinois, there are many of our relatives, such as the Potawatomi, the Winnebago, who are the ancestral stewards of that land, who have been there for thousands of years, just like my folks here on the East Coast, who raised our families here, practice governance, cosmology, science, history, uh, medicine, food knowledge, sustainability ways, love, and of course, through colonization, forced removals, genocide, these things were taken away. And at the, while America continued to grow and expand at the expense of the indigenous people here and enslaved African Americans. And so we must recognize the harm done in the past. And so and by sharing this, it's a remembrance and a reminder, and that not just to talk about it with land acknowledgements and so on, but having accountability and intentional actions. And so the second thing I would like to do to open up this keynote, somebody mentioned I was a musician, so you can expect music. The drum to tribal people, it's very significant. I mean, very significant. This, as we call it, the heartbeat of Mother Earth. And there's a reason for that. When you hear this sound, it sounds like a heartbeat. And we are taught that when we think about the two-legged, us human beings and other species and other living things, we must remember not to look at the external, because usually when I'm speaking in a large audience, talking to a diverse crowd, I'll ask folks to look to the left, look to the right, and what they'll observe is that maybe the person sitting next to them may not have the same color skin tone, they may not be the same gender, they may not have the same kind of hair, they may not have no hair. But on the inside, we keep remembering that everybody is doing this, all of us. And so all these external things that keep us divided kind of melt away. Remember that you're talking to a heartbeat just like you. And this goes for the four-legged and the winged, and the water as well. Some of you folks out there who study science, we know that right down on the molecular level, we're all the same. And in my native culture, we call that all my relations. In science, they call it quantum physics. So they're catching up. They're catching up. And so I want to share this song to kind of welcome all of us into this space. Yahweh, wait out here, what and I when a hiccup. Yahweh, wait out here, wait out and out, wait out, Yahweh, 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 wait out here, wait out and out, wait out, Yahweh, wait out here, wait out and out, wait out, Yahweh, Yahweh, wait out here, wait out and out, wait out, Yahweh, wait out here, wait out and out, wait out, Yahweh, good job. Thank you. Kutabarimish, we say in our language, but which means thank you very much. So then, before I go any further, I just also want to wish everybody blessings and good health. This has been really a crazy time, right? The last year and a half, and I need to acknowledge that you know, I hope whatever you folks are going through out there, that this music and the sharing can bring some healing and joy in your life. Certainly, there's been a lot of tragedy in many tribal communities, mine included. So it's important to remember and reflect that. And so I hope going forward, we can all take that a little bit of that medicine and pass it on. And so at this point, I am going to do the share screen thing, just kind of go over some stuff. And I'm also an educator. I'm retired from that segment of my life, but I do love to speak, so I'm going to try to keep it to my limit. And I kind of use the slides to kind of keep me in line. So, okay, we're going to skip that. And all right, I need slideshow beginning. I learned a lot about PowerPoints being in this situation here. Okay, so this is me right here. And so as mentioned, I'm a writer, poet, cultural educator, traditional storyteller. I did some little bit of film. I'm also a playwright. I wrote my first play this year and acted it out. A very moving experience that I took part in, and hopefully I'll get to talk a little bit about that after. I'm also the director of the Okiteo Cultural Center. I am wicked excited to talk about that. And yes, we say wicked on the East Coast. We are the first and only Indigenous run and operated cultural Native American center in all of Central and Western Mass. There's never been one before, and this has really been an incredible time of reckoning, of awakening. Just really a lot of firsts right now. I don't know about folks out there, but we are experiencing so many firsts here on the East Coast in terms of allyship, in terms of support, and it's a really incredible movement, the awakening that's happening. Unfortunately, it's juxtaposed by a lot of tragedy, right? But for example, the Boston Marathon, this iconic race, right? For the first time ever, it did a land acknowledgement before the race. I got to do it. It was crazy. You know, I'm out at the starting line, which is it's on Nipmuc homeland, our tribe. So they invited us to come, and I got to sing and do the opening land acknowledgement at the Boston Marathon. Pretty exciting stuff to be out there, and all the security was crazy, you can imagine. But it was it was electric, and the day before, I got to spend time with a lot of the athletes and all that. So yeah, I've been doing this work now for about 30 years, a little bit more. I've traveled to just about everywhere in the world, sharing the culture of my people, the traditions, and it's just been a true gift to be able to do that and pass this on. And some of the photos you're looking at here to the far upper corner there, that's me when I was in Greenland. I was touring that area of the world. I went to Sweden and Iceland, and in that particular photo there, I was at some of the Inuit villages there in Greenland and really had a wonderful experience sharing with the youth there. This photo that you see there is at one of the many, sad to say, orphanages there, because the Indigenous people there, much like the States, have a disproportionate amount of children without homes. And this has many reasons, and a lot of that is the generational trauma of the systemic abuse and colonization and just a whole lot of other bad stuff. And the top photo to the other side, that's me, not far from where you folks are. That's when I was in the Forest County Potawatomi tribe, which is indigenous to the area of Illinois. And I was spending some time with my relatives over there. And then the other photos, that's some of our tribal folks there. I'm making drums and I'm doing what I love to do and get in front of kids and jump around and tell stories. And it's really fun. And of course, with the pandemic, I've kind of been here. And so it really takes a lot away from that to be able to do that. But, you know, we've been doing the best we can. And so I started this work, as I said, as a very young person, because growing up in Massachusetts as an Indigenous person was the worst time of my life. And this probably goes for many other Native people. It was a very abusive environment, bullying, and sometimes the students weren't no better. Yes, I'm talking about the teachers. They were pretty bad to us. And I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and also I usually tell my whole story, but we don't have the time to get into too much of that. But me and my siblings were first generation city. In other words, my mom and all the people prior to that were living in these tribal enclaves in various parts of our tribal homeland, which I'll share in a little bit. And essentially, they lived in the backwoods, away from white people. So the only other folks around were them, and brown people like them who were part of their community. And so my mom moved to the city, Springfield, a good sized city. And so when we were little, and we really didn't have any understanding of how to traverse this new world of essentially was black and white. and there was a lot of race riots going on, and we were just kind of like, kind of looking both ways, like, what do we do? Because we were still relegated to the fantasy world and caricaturized, and it was really, really jarring experience for us. And so we lived in this predominantly Black neighborhood. There were some poor white families there, but it was mostly Black. And I remember when I hit junior high, they bust us all out. There was still busing and segregation, yes, in liberal Massachusetts. Uh, and and I didn't reflect on it until years later that I remember all the kids from the neighborhood, we all ended up in the same class, you know, and we got to raise hell, and we fooled around, and nobody cared. And I was having a ball at 13 and 14 years old. I thought it was great. And the white kids moved up and down the halls like ghostly knights, just like with this enchantment about them, who called the teacher by their first name. Um, and we were essentially like hapless bystanders benefiting from white proximity, because um, none of the contributions that Indigenous people had made were ever mentioned. None of it was ever talking about. I didn't learn how the women's suffrage movement was actually started by Indigenous women. I didn't learn that without Native people's tenacity and the things that they discovered, there would have never been an industrial revolution, because what do we need for that, right? The main ingredients of that is steel, petroleum, and rubber. Well, rubber and petroleum were products of Indigenous people that discovered those. And the vulcanization was going on in South America long before Goodyear. And so these things were never taught. They didn't teach us about the Declaration of Independence itself, that was inspired by the Haudenosaunee people, our neighbors here, and the freedom that we had. And on, our food, 80% of our foods come from Indigenous people. The poetry, the cosmology, the science, and a word that you don't usually hear when you hear indigeneity and Indigenous epistemology is science. And it's an incredible amount of science and understanding. And I always argue that Indigenous people are the first scientists, because what is science at its core? It's observation. And we really took a lot of time in watching things, how they function, whether it was the animals, the way the water moves, the way the seasons change. The entire sky was our maps. This is why Indigenous cosmology was so crucial, and space and where we are so crucial to the understanding that reflects your identity. When colonization struck and all the genocide and these things were removed, what happens? The skies no longer spoke our language. They spoke Greek, right? The land began to speak English, Greek, English, and many other languages that had no reflection of this land, and including a religion that didn't reflect this land. And so you have this cataclysmic effect on Indigenous people, and probably the most damaging of all is the alcohol that came to our communities. The weaponization of alcohol that destroyed many of our people, including almost myself. And so we live with these traumas. We live with these things that are not discussed. So okay, we're gonna skip that. And most of all, when we reflect on Indigenous culture and history, we need to understand that it doesn't start in 1492. We're talking about thousands and thousands of years of culture that went on, spiritually, ecology, horticulture, science, that all came back to sustain this quality of life that sustained us for eons. And so we need to keep that in mind, and that the trauma of colonialism is not the starting point of who we are. And so here we go. We're going to get to this here. And so here you see we are in the East Coast here. That's Massachusetts. And as you see right there in the middle, that's the Nipmuc homeland. And the white lines kind of show it out there. And the Nipmuc homeland, prior to contact, was once 2,000 square miles in Massachusetts alone. I don't have the numbers for Rhode Island and Connecticut and the tip of southern New Hampshire, but in Massachusetts alone, our homeland was 2,000 square miles. And Nipmuc means people of the water, people of the fresh water. And it was a very spiritual significance to the water for our people, because the rivers, and we have the ocean there. We are deeply connected to that. And, all of us, we spend as much time on the water as we can. And I'm going to share some stuff about that later. But by the time of the 1900s, our homeland was reduced to 5 acres in a little town called Grafton, Massachusetts, the last unceded land of our tribal reservation. But through a tremendous amount of work from our tribal people and allies. We now have over 100 acres of land returned to our community, and there's even more on the way. And considering it was thousands of square miles in the past, but it went down to 5 acres. So we look at a couple hundred acres as a win and a turning of the tide, as it were. So if you look at this here, these are important numbers, and they are by no means static, because we keep learning more. In my 30 years of traveling and learning about my ancestors through academia, as well as lived experience, as well as going through those hidden archives, we know that we talk about pre-contact, about the numbers of people here, 18 to 20 million. But we now know that those numbers are a lot larger. There's much more folks were here. These were modest numbers taken some time ago. The numbers are significantly larger, and we've been here a lot longer than they've always said, and we keep telling them we've always been here. And now they keep finding things, and the dates keep going back and back, and eventually they'll get to what we've been telling them. Now, but what we do know more concretely is by the 1900s, there were 250,000 Native peoples here, because they were counting us. They had a very good census about Indians, where they were on the reservation, off the reservation, and the ones they were stealing to these boarding schools, which were the concentration camps that they put our children in. And as you see this important date here, between 1803 and to 1912, 32 states were added to the Union of the United States. And this is a direct correlation to the genocide that was taking place. Now, to you math folks out there, if you look at just taking this modest number, 18 to 20 million, and then the population is reduced to 250,000, this is the largest genocide rate in human history that's ever been documented. And then they don't talk about that, right? This is not part of our history lesson. Today, the Native population is about 6.8 million and growing, because they are making babies. They are not playing. So, and so speaking of babies, there's my 2-year-old, because that's a hard conversation. I usually throw him in there. He's 2 years old now. That's my little guy. Okay, bye, Kateo. Okay, so what happened? Here you see what I was mentioning just briefly is the boarding schools, a disruption of our culture through disease, war, removal, erasure, boarding schools, institutionalized racism and loss of culture to the point of where we've been characterized to the 21st and 20th century, where we can have our images freely on football helmets and school mascots, where we're in this perpetual state of violence and this is because that's what we are, right? We're just we're just this cheering device, and not even human anymore, because we've been reduced to this one mode, right? And this is what the effects of these boarding schools were, where language, culture, hair was cut off. The stories of the abuse are gut wrenching that have came out from these boarding schools, and of late, the discovery of the bodies of these children around these residential and boarding schools is nothing new to Indigenous people. We've been having this conversation for a very long time, including my latest book, Drumming and Dreaming. I dedicated the forward of this book is dedicated to all the children who died, never got to hear their traditional stories. And I had a very moving experience when I was in Lawrence, Kansas, at the Haskell University there. And so now I always like to share this, because when we talk about our stories, when we think about, as I said, the stories that bind us and our lived experience and what it means to be sovereign, sovereignty has come down to Indigenous people just for the right to exist, and to not be judged by just trying to survive. There was this wonderful writer who recently wrote a quote. I can't think of his name now, but he said that, please don't expect Black and brown folks to do the heavy emotional lifting. Just trying to survive a day in America is tough enough. And I'm paraphrasing that, but I thought that was concrete. And so these stories are not abstract. And so what you're looking at here is some documents from my family. And another thing they never teach us in school is that Native American people are the highest enlisted people in the U.S. military for their population. So in other words, Native Americans are joining the service more than any other group of people per ratio of their population. And my family is no exception. I have 2 grandfathers who are Revolutionary War soldiers, and I have 36 members of my family who served in the Union Army during the Civil War, including two grandfathers. They were father and son there at the same time. And the document you're looking at here is one of my grandfathers, Samuel Vickers. He was there fighting in his son. He died, and his father had to come back and tell his family that, my son died, and it was a very sad story. Um, he died in the infamous Andersonville prison in Fort Jackson, fighting for freedom that he didn't even have, because in 1862 and 3, he was not a citizen of the United States. He was a ward of the state. And what's so tragic about this is that while he was off fighting, his land, as you see the documents to the right, were usurped by the white warden, ward of the estates, because they, even though we had our land titles, our property, our tribal communities, they would still have the right to take it. And that's what they did. They took his land, and then they took all 6 of his children, put them in these boarding schools or on the farms. Now on the East Coast, they would take children and put them as servants in white households. They'll put them to work on the farms to grow the tobacco and the different things that they were now so excited about that they never had before. And so, a lot of these kids would just disappear. I have a great uncle who died in the school, and a great aunt, Anna Mae Vickers, as you see her name there, she disappears, and we're still trying to figure out what happened to her. And so these are not abstract stories. And this happened to 3 generations of my family. The last child that was taken away from us is my grandfather's oldest brother. He was born in 1867. My grandfather was born in 1907, so he was too young about the time they were rounding kids up. But my oldest grandfather's sibling did go. And a really sad story in itself. And so the stories that bind us are not quite what they seem to be. So then, one of my favorite tribal leaders, George Erasmus, once said, "Where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no community. Where community is to be formed, common memory must be created." Now, just looking at what you have here, these 2 charts, it's quite a contrast, one would say. We have the myth of America and the shared and lived experience. We have discovered lands, God-chosen people, exceptionalism, freedom, opportunity, promised lands. And on the other hand, we have the shared lived experience of genocide, stolen lands, enslavement, forced removals, internment camps, mascots, segregation, Jim Crow laws, children separated at our borders. I mean, this is nothing new, and the police brutality in our communities. And so, what do we do with this, right? This is jarring. And this is happening today. It's not of the past, right? You could see that the genocide and enslavement, they may have been a couple hundred years old, but we still had the arbiters of that, right? Mass incarceration, police brutality, segregation, which is still alive and well, redlining. All these things are still happening, throughout America. The institutionalized racism of our education system, the quota systems, right, for Black and brown and Asian folks. These things are still prevalent. People of color can't get loans in places that they want for a home. So that has nothing to do with being exceptional or freedom or opportunity, right, for some. Ellis Island was welcoming a lot of people, but there was a lot of people here who couldn't get a job, were waiting to work, right? And so, for example, my relatives, and it's kind of told in such a heartfelt story now about Indian baskets, and sometimes you can see these very expensive baskets on eBay and these native arts that were created around the 1800s. Well, a lot of that art came from because they couldn't get jobs. So they were making these things for white people so they can get some money to eat and live when their land was taken away because they couldn't work. And so, some of my uncles were amazing basket makers, and they made brooms and all these cool things. And the white folks ate them up. They loved it, right? Because it was Indian art. But they were making it because they couldn't get a job. They weren't allowed to work. And so these are the things that we live with. And despite all that, we are still here. And this is my great grandmother. Unfortunately, I didn't get to meet her. She died the year I was born. And she was, for lack of a better term, a medicine woman, as her uncle was. His name was Samuel Hazard. And the document that you're looking to her on the other side there is some of our traditional medicines that were used to save people's lives. Now, that story that's written there was taken around, say around 1820 or 1830. And there were some white families who were kind of pioneering, as it were, to use that term, out into the wilderness and making these homes. So they were out there living in the cabin. There was the little girl that lived there near my tribal community. She was really sick, and my great uncle Samuel Hazard, they called him the Indian, he saved her life, and he used the medicines that he mentions there to save her life. And he's talking about mountain men and some other words I can't even pronounce. So, and this traditional knowledge is life-saving. It's life-giving, and so we have to kind of acknowledge that and remember that the power that Indigenous people had on this land because of that continuous knowledge of place. And so I'm going to stop in a little bit, but I'm going to skip over and show you about what we're doing, because I can't shout enough through the rooftops about the Untitled Cultural Center. It is a place for learning, creativity. I mean, we do things from brain tanning traditional hides to STEM work, right? Kids are doing their science, their technology, they're learning skills for academia, but they're also learning how to craft. And we're connected with the double-edged theater. So we have theater, art, science, education, music, and an educational component where we're teaching educators. We're doing fellowships, workshops. And speaking of firsts, so these are some of our different things that we do. For those who don't know what this is, it's not called a canoe, but it's a mashoon, which is another word for canoe. And this historic mashoon, as I said at time of first, it was the first mashoon that we were able to have done on our homeland in 300 years. So the way we make canoes is by fire is a tool. You put the fire inside and you carve the log right out using fire. Just amazing, amazing experience. And we just finished that up this week. Really powerful time it was. And we took it out on the lake, and just really a really beautiful experience. There we are there, still working on it. And as you see, everything is part of that function. You know, we're cooking food on it. That's a picture of one of my books there. So I'm going to stop the screen right now, check the time. And I want to jump here a little bit and before I turn it over to Q&A, and just briefly talk about sovereignty, in that the legal definition is the right to self-governance. And obviously Native people did not have that because it's a quasi-sovereign, whereas the federal, state, and government still has the right to take land, the right to terminate a tribe. The Commerce Clause, what is that? That's Article 1, Section 8 permits Congress to make laws pertaining to Indian trade. So it is really a pseudo, right, power. So when we think about sovereignty, it's really the government's power over Indigenous people, right? The power to control, contain, and rewrite a narrative that is foreign to our existence. So if we are operating in a sovereign ideology that is not consistent with our teachings, then our starting point of self-determination can only exist within these same destructive parameters that got us where we are today. And that's important to remember. And I always like to tell folks, and sometimes this is really a hard thing to kind of take in. When I say, you look at the Declaration of Independence, which, these articles in the Constitution were written during the time of chattel slavery, and when they were out just killing Indians and, and taking their land. So, and the document reflects that. Whereas the Declaration of Independence, I think 26 lines below, we the people says, calls Indians wild, merciless savages. And the Constitution calls Black people 3/5 of a person. But so even more than that, if you are a person of color in the United States, the Constitution, which many people get all glossy-eyed over and they wrap themselves up in it, I mean, the reality of that is that if you are a person of color, you only had full access to that for about 20% of the time it's been written. So we think about enslavement, we think about the Jim Crow laws, segregation, all the way up to 1965, right? When we just finally start to get an opportunity. And then for Native American people, the right to drum and practice our culture would not come until 1978, right? And Native American people were not considered citizens until 1924. So you're looking at about 20% of the time since that document has been enjoyed by others, that we've only had 20% of its full use. And that's notwithstanding the continued abuse that we experience at the institutional level. And so the way to address that is to confront it and to work together, because these when I was a kid, as I said, growing up in the 70s and 80s, and we were called horrible things just right out in the open. And I've seen my Black friends being called horrible things, Latino, and we had to ignore it, just walk away and pretend you didn't hear it, because that was the only way to deal with it. Today, that's not the case. And so we need to confront racism. We need to confront it and dismantle it everywhere we see it safely. And I always add that caveat, safely, because it's a crazy world. And so I want to stop here, because there's just so much I could talk about in terms of, the things that are going on, but more importantly, how do we get through this, right? Because you know, white folks could sit in guilt or anger or bitterness and say, that was so long, I'm not a part of that, and just kind of put up those walls. And but I encourage folks, and when I share this, sometimes they get upset, they want to walk out the room, they want to throw things at me. But I encourage folks there's a reckoning that's upon us. And we all need to recognize that in terms of being on the right side of history. All of us may not have had a hand in some of those horrible things in the past, but there are some who are benefiting of it right now, today. And you need to recognize that. You need to recognize your privilege, recognize and how you can do better, and how you can take the power that you have. One of the things that allies always ask me about is, what can I do to help make some of these systemic changes? And something I heard an elder once tell me is that, you have access that we don't have. When you're sitting around a dinner table and your uncle says something, or somebody or another relative makes a comment, or you're seeing something happen that will happen in these private spaces, it's your duty to confront it, because you know what's wrong, and help start that conversation. And so I want to stop there and leave some time for some questions. And I truly thank you all for listening. And thank you. I know I went a little long.
You could have gone longer. I was really enjoying it. I'm sure everyone else was as well.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Like Lindy said, I definitely was enjoying it. Now we're going to sort of open up the floor for questions and answers. So if anyone has questions for Larry, then you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question, or you could also put it into the chat.
So while folks are getting ready, just please, if you want to learn more about Okie Cultural Center, like we can put the link in there. Please go to our website, see the work that we're doing, how we're empowering and uplifting our folks. And so, as I said, I've been very fortunate. And as a writer, I don't want to keep talking, because I do want to get the questions in. But as a performer and singer, I had the platform to get my work out there. But it's very difficult in the literary world. And if you're a writer, you know what I mean. So we try to uplift artists and everybody we can to get their work out there. So I'm really happy to be able to the work that Okie is doing. But we need to pay people, right? Pay our artists, pay performers, right? Proper remuneration is key, because we're tired of working for free, and so that's a big one. There it is.
I do have a question. So you chuckled about making babies, but I actually was recently listening to a podcast that is about blood quantum and kind of the contention about some Indigenous people who are reaching kind of like the minimum requirements of having blood quantum, and then making the decision on who they make babies with, because obviously the government's intention was for blood quantum to kind of filter out the blood at some point, so there's less sovereignty of the Indigenous nations. I was curious if you wouldn't mind either reflecting on that, or kind of maybe what are your thoughts about that, because I thought it was just a really interesting reflection on it.
Yeah, that is a very complex issue and a troubling one for me, for that matter, in my opinion, because blood quantum is not something originally done here. It was something brought on by colonization, and tribal nations picked up on it. I see it as more destructive, and every tribe is its own nation, as it were, and has its own government set up, and they make the decisions on blood quantum. Not every tribe does that. For example, my tribe does not have a blood quantum. It has a descendancy, um, and that could be sometimes that could be just as difficult when paperwork has been burned and there's nothing there. And so the whole idea of enrollment is very complex, because you'll have people who, even though, for example, we're not doing blood quantum, they still can't get enrolled because they don't have the proper paperwork. And so it's a very difficult process. But I think blood quantum is probably the most insidious, because it lends itself to just eventually wiping your community out. And it's really not practical in so many ways. But we some folks have been convinced by doing that it's about preserving funding and certain things that are set up for a certain few of people. So it's kind of a machination. I see it in that sense. But I mean, every nation can do what they please, and I spoke out against it, and I continue to.
Thanks. That's what I was interested in, because I feel like it has been, since I've heard the topic, everyone is different, and the different nations feel
Right.
differently about it. So I appreciate you sharing your thoughts. I greatly do. Thank you.
Right. Thank you.
Mhm.
We have a question in the chat. They asked, how do you think Indigenous people could be best represented on a world stage such as the United Nations?
Them being there, representing themselves. Somebody from those communities is the best representation. And that's a great question, because one of the allies and the accomplices will usually ask, what's the best way I can help? And I will always say centering the Native voice, uh, and asking them, what do they need? And so that is crucial. Um, and and I think I kind of touched on that. The boarding school was the boarding school genocide was part state, part the church, right? And something I'd like to always point out was that when we talk about reconciliation or conciliation, um, there's important things to remember going with that question, that if we're going to have a conversation about conciliation, healing, the church can't lead that conversation. If we're going to have a conversation about immigration, the United States can't lead that conversation. It has to be Indigenous people, people of color, the people who most harmed. You can't have the people who had a hand in the abuse to lead the conversation. It doesn't make sense. For example, United States, you have one group of immigrants telling another group of immigrants what to do. It's really absurd when you look at it. And so centering that Indigenous voice is key. And if you don't, the conversation, there's no integrity in it. Thank you all for the comments. I'm reading some of it there. Mhm. This happens sometimes. Folks are like kind of taking in everything I said, and and gets a little but so and it is a lot to take in, and I'm just glossing over things due to time. But I encourage folks, please dig deeper into all these issues. There's so much um, that needs to be addressed to get to the heart of the issues that we're all experiencing now. Um, um, and um, and as I said it before, I've been doing this 3 decades and speaking much like saying the same things I'm saying now. Um, and um, and I say this kind of half joking but serious, is that us folks, and I even like to use the term people of color, because that's kind of like we're of color, but the normalcy is this. But what I'm saying is that we're spending our times defending our right to exist. We're spending our time marching, picketing, fighting legislation to change laws. For example, the implicit racism in Columbus Day. I mean, being a business owner now of a director of a cultural center, I'm dealing a lot with arts and theater and so on. And what's the big word now? Diversity, equity, and inclusion. Yay! And after the George Floyd murder, there was a writer who eloquently put all these art institutions on call, and that infamous Google list, all the folks who weren't supporting. And then the question was, what took you so long, right? And I say that meaning, slavery went on for hundreds of years. Nobody thought that this was wrong. And you have a holiday like Columbus Day, right? Responsible for genocide and bringing slavery into the Western Hemisphere, all that fun stuff. And not to mention saying that he discovered something where there were millions of people already here. The implicit racism in that statement itself is just, we have normalized structural racism so much that we can't see beyond that paradigm of like saying that it's okay to say that, once he got here, then we could say, okay, now there are people here. Overlooking the millions of people that were already here. The implicit racism is jarring that we can't see that. And then to even argue about having it and keeping it as a holiday is even more absurd. But we have made ourselves so accustomed to the idea that we all have these certain positions in life and hierarchy of color, right? Yeah, so don't get me going again. I want to answer some questions.
I was going to say you were about to get into something I'm so interested in hearing people talk about, to the hierarchy of color as well, because there's colorism and how people are perceived and like things like that. So I know you're wanting to go, but I just wanted to say thank you for going there.
Oh, yes.
But I'll leave it also for other questions because I've already asked. So.
Hi, I have a
Hello.
question if there's time. Hi, my name's Krista. I'm
Hi.
from the Fort Belknap Reservation in Montana. I know I don't look it. My mother is Nakota.
Oh, nice.
My question is, since you brought up Columbus Day and you brought up people learning how to be an ally, what are your thoughts on Thanksgiving, which is coming up very soon, and appreciating and being an ally to Indigenous people during that like government mandated holiday? People are taking time off. It's a time for gathering. How do you recommend people who want to be an ally do that with that holiday like on everyone's minds and in everyone's households?
Wow. Okay, first I want to say kwai kwai, as we say. I lived for a little bit up in Treaty 4, Saskatchewan, in the standing buffalo reserve up. Oh my God, it's so cold up there. Holy.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
That's because it's right above Montana. So yeah, up in right outside of Regina and Fort Capel. Yeah, so I just wanted to say that. So yeah, the perfect segue to that is my book, The Morning Road to Thanksgiving. It really covers a lot of that information that you asked. And for example, you get to learn about the first Thanksgiving was actually in 1637 after the massacre of the Pequot Indians. I mean, we had our famous so-called dinner of 1620. It kind of gets to all that too. But being a good ally is about, I think, bringing that awareness about what that holiday really represented, which was the genocide of Indigenous people of the land, celebrating their death. And during that time, during that era, 1700s, after a massacre, there was usually a celebration that ensued. And so this was no different. So it was common practice, but after they killed the Pequot Indians, they said, let this be a day of Thanksgiving that we honor every year. And so that was kind of how it started. And then again, we know during the Civil War period, Abraham Lincoln wanted to bring the unions together and so on. So they tried to make it a federal holiday and all that. But and each year we have a day of mourning here in Plymouth. And so there is a lot of educational information that our Indigenous people are getting out there now. And so again, the best way to be an ally is to get that material from the Indigenous voices and propel that out there. Let that proliferate and stand there and be their shield sometimes, because that's what they need, and be their support. Yeah. I think that's it. think we have time for a couple more questions.
I had a question. I sort of was just trying to see what your thoughts were on like land acknowledgements. I cannot get my words out. I'm sorry, on land acknowledgements. Because our campus is looking into finalizing our land acknowledgement along with the whole SIU system. So I was really just wondering your thoughts on them.
I think they're important. And first, I'll say this part is that they're important, but the keys to the land acknowledgement is that you must include action steps. For example, our land acknowledgements here that we advise people and consult folks on, like, and it can't be a permanent action step either, because there's always ongoing issues. Like right now, we're in our state, we're dealing with the mascot issues, and we're dealing with education. And by the way, I'm also an artist in residence myself at Bunker Hill College, where we're creating an entirely new curriculum around Indigenous studies across the board and all the different academic studies that's going to be required reading. And so the action steps are key to that. And so whatever the issues are going around in your community, that this is what folks can do, whether it's give money to a youth center, whether it's join to stop a pipeline. These are the action steps that land acknowledgement shows. So that's very important. And the second part I want to say to that is that it's a recognition that where we are, it's an important step, because once we start saying things, accountability is soon to follow. I have a really funny short story, but that so this junior high I went to, as I mentioned earlier, being the worst back in the early late 70s when I went through there. As I said, I'm still traumatized by the things that went on there, the blatant racism from the teachers and all that. And so, and as I said, I've been doing this about 3 decades, and I've been all over the place, the country, and schools and universities. And so about 2 months ago, I get an email from that high school asking me to come and do a talk and do a land acknowledgement. I just stared at the email for a minute, and then I wrote the teacher, like, some of the bad things that happened to me there was when I was a child. And I said, she's never going to respond. And she did. And she was like, oh my God, Larry, this is why I'm doing this now. Because when I was a kid, there was no land acknowledgement. There was nothing to even say that I even existed as a human being. And then to have my school where abuse took place send me that request, not knowing who I was, just out of the blue, because I'm on these different sites. And it just kind of, I laughed, I looked at that, I said, wow, but so I think they mean a lot to a lot of people. So I think one more if we have time. But yes, folks, go to okiteo.org, check out some of our Living Presence series, see the different videos that we have up, learn more about my work. My co-director, Rhonda Anderson, she's from Nupiaq, Alaska, Indigenous from there. As I said, we're just really elated to be the first Native run and operated cultural center in all of that part of the state. I mean, so it's a really big step. And one of the things I frequently say of late is I'm seeing things I thought I'd never see in my lifetime. So it's a really exciting time to be a part of this movement and this work. So I really appreciate to continue to share this and just kind of pass it on and get other people inspired about, what can be accomplished when we work together. I think Paul's back to do his closing. Yay.
It looks like we have one final question in the chat.
Okay.
Shavante, did you want to read it or you want me to get it? I got it. So do you know of a collection of talking points for allies? For instance, if someone doesn't understand why mascots could be inappropriate, what could we say?
That's a great question. And I think it's going to be specific to the different tribal areas. Again, that's a perfect thing to go to okiteo.org. We have some of that information. We have tons of information about mascots because we're fighting legislation right now. And then when I mentioned earlier about how exhausted we get of doing all this heavy lifting, some of my little cousin Brittany Wallace, she goes town to town fighting the mascots in the high schools. Now, why can't this happen on a state or federal level? But instead of out there enjoying herself as a young woman, she's got to do this work to prove that we have a right to have a safe school environment too, and not be ridiculed and characterized in this minstrel show like images of us. So yeah, check out Okie Tale. You'll see some information up there.
Thank you very, very much. Sorry, I was actually reading through your website. That's why I clicked over very slow.
All right, it's catchy.
But thank you so much for speaking with us today and sharing like so much of your personal story with us today. Just thank you for being with us. I wanted to mention that we are also finalizing our land acknowledgement statement across the SIU system, and it's anticipated to be released soon. This land acknowledgement will recognize that our campuses exist on and serve a region that includes the traditional homelands of the Illinois Confederacy. This acknowledgement will also be released with additional commitments, pathways, and opportunities for Indigenous students in the advancement of research and knowledge about Indigenous peoples, culture, and history. And now with that, we will have closing remarks from our Southern Illinois University Carbondale's Vice Chancellor for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, Dr. Paul Frazier.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you guys enjoyed Mr. Larry Spotted Crowman. And for me, I'm more excited about a partnership that we discussed earlier, that we make this event better and that we really have a chance to celebrate the whole month. I'm glad that we've been able to partner this year, but I'm looking forward, really looking forward to the things we're going to be able to accomplish in the very near future. So I want to thank each one of you for coming out, and Larry, thank you for giving us your time and efforts. And I actually have purchased the books. I'm not gonna lie, I hadn't started reading them, but I did purchase them.
Thank you.
I did purchase them, but looking forward to working with you. Really am.
Yes. Thank you so much, Paul. Yes, exciting. Absolutely.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you again to our keynote speaker. Please join us this Wednesday, November 17th, for our next event. We'll be screening the movie Two Spirits here in the Hub, and it will also be streamed virtually. It'll begin at 5 p.m. We hope to see you all there, and have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you all. Thank you. Take care.